So thanks for coming. Let me talk about a couple of things up front. And let me first of all acknowledge that I have at least, no, three. I saw Barbara. Where's Barbara? Barbara's right there. Four. I have 4 school committee members who are here with us this evening as well, and they've been at a number of these forums. We've done Pierce, we've done Baker so far, all very interesting conversations about short-term space, which is where I'll start tonight, and then talk about a couple other things, and then open up for questions that you might have, okay? All right, so short-term space. We have a document now called Options and Needs and Options, that spells out, doesn't spell out recommendations, but says here are the problems across all the schools, and I think that's an important point for this. I hope that's come through in that document. This is not about any one school. It's really about all the schools, I would say, outside of Runkle and Heath that we've renovated, but really has great impact across all of the schools. So that's the first point I want to make on that. And then spells out a number of options. And now what we've been charged with is really taking a look at those options and bringing some things forward. So let me walk you through, as much as anything, sort of that process of making recommendations, right? Because I don't have the recommendation, but I can walk you through how we're getting there. So, and this is consistent. You can go on that YouTube channel and you'll hear me say the same thing. We start with this building. And we start with our desire to make sure that, if we can, we exit all students during the construction project. Okay? So that's the first priority. If we were able to achieve that priority, we would then deal with the Pierce and Baker problems from there, and we've laid out other solutions outside of the use of Old Lincoln in their solutions. So let me talk a little bit about where we are with that, right? We are this could sound like something I said a year ago for those of you who were here, I'm sorry. But we continue to look for places even outside of Brookline. We don't believe there are places where we could move, I think I mentioned in that document, K through 3 or K through 4. We don't believe that there are places in town where we could hold school for X number of years for those grades. We don't believe they exist. But we said before that we were going to look even outside of Brookline, and we are. That means Boston, that means Watertown, that means Newton, that yes, any place within a decent kind of busing distance that we could find an appropriate school situation we're looking for. And we're, when we get to the point where we don't think that's possible, we're going to take it off the table. We're not to the point of taking it off the table. That's the best I can give you for tonight. We're not to the point yet where we take it off the table, because we still have some conversations that are ongoing in that area. So that means that we would use Old Lincoln for other grades, right? So we've already identified 6, 7, and 8, and it may go beyond that in that scenario. Now, I want to say to you tonight that it may actually go beyond that, even if we weren't able to find a location for K through 3 or K through 4. Because moving everyone out of the building saves us money, and more importantly, maybe to you, saves us time. So there was an early scenario that you may have seen that actually shows that if we didn't have anyone on site, we save all but a year. That's significant when you're looking at the high school problem that we have. And you probably think it's significant just for having your students come back. We do too. So, but short of that, creating less grade levels in the building can make our transitions easier. And the transitions in the very good scheme, and I'm not going to go into any of that tonight unless you want me to. Joe has it set up here. Thank you, Joe, for doing that. But let me say here that the work that the architects have done, particularly in the last 3 or 4 weeks after the approval at the MSBA, has been really terrific. Really, really terrific, both in terms of looking at space along the side of the building and in terms of classroom configurations, all of those kinds of things. But what remains is a really difficult set of transitions within the building for students that we have. So the more grade levels we can exit, the easier it is for us to do that. And so we would look at adding fifth to that equation if that were something that helped us. And we could come up with other plans for the other schools. So we're looking at other plans for those two schools, Baker and Pierce in particular. And we're looking at the number of students that we can move out of this site, and we continue to look at whether we can move all of the students off this site. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's where we are. So all of that, whether we rent space for certain classes or offices or whatever it may be, all has to be factored into what's called the capital improvement plan, the CIP, at the town level. And so the deputy town administrator would like our recommendations that we make, that the school committee signs off on. He would have liked those recommendations yesterday, actually about 3 weeks ago. So some people have said, when do you sort of have to make a decision on this? And it's soon. I mean, at Thursday's school committee meeting, we're going to discuss where we are with some of these, because we still have some outside of Brookline places in play. We won't have final recommendations. That'll have to happen though before the 18th, because we have to put a capital improvement plan together if we're going to rent space, for Pierce, if we're going to put modulars in some place. Those things have to go into the capital improvement plan, and they have to go into the capital improvement plan now. Okay? So there's a time crunch, and it's this month. Okay? So you may want to ask a question about that. The other thing that some people have asked me about is next year, right? And grades 6 and 7 in particular. And last year I wouldn't have thought that would even be a question, because we were looking at certain numbers, and those numbers clearly drove us to the point where we were going to be overcrowded by next year. But you probably know as much as we do that we experienced in grades 4 through 8 some decline in enrollment across the system, and in particular here. Now, we've done some study of the whys of that, and we're not sure they lead to any long-term trends. In fact, we don't believe they do. But we did experience those numbers, and we actually were able to consolidate. So what we're looking at now are the issues of whether we have other consolidations in our future in this building in those grade levels. In other words, in a grade level that has 77 students right now and 4 classes, do we believe that would be at a number that would allow us to run 3 classes next year? Because if it did, we'd have to look closely at this building and all grades for next year. Now, here's what I'm going to do for tonight. I'm going to give you actually both sides of that argument, and I'm happy to tell you where I come down on it. Okay? So on one side, there is this: you can consolidate, you can keep all students K through 8 in the building for another year, right? That saves you money in terms of opening the building a year earlier than you were going to, in terms of the staff that have to be hired, not the teachers who work here now, but staff who have to be hired, custodians, secretary, those kinds of things. And it saves you transportation. Now here's the other side of the argument. This building and a number of my others are already too overcrowded for the adults. So what we talk a lot about are the classrooms. And it's true that with a number of consolidations, we could probably create the classrooms. But we have an override set of questions right now in front of the Board of Selectmen. And if they get adopted in some manner, then they create more literacy staff, they create more math staff, they create more guidance counselors, they create more nurses. And where do they work in this building next year? In the halls? Because there aren't any spaces for them. So at some point, I've said to one group after another the last 2 weeks, I'm an educator, right? I'm not a person who was trained in my original training in developing budgets and doing layouts of buildings. I'm an educator, and what I know at some point is that begins to impact the quality of what teachers are able to provide for your kids.
Sorry, why next year?
Pardon?
You said next year?
Well,
For
in a successful, in a theoretical successful override that would occur in May, we have proposals in those numbers that add those staff, right? Add to the staffing in literacy, in math, in nursing, in guidance, and in other areas.
Next year,
And so it would
7
add
and
them
8
next
are not
year.
gonna be
Right,
there.
but I'm saying under the argument of do whatever you can to keep students in the
Oh,
building
I
here
see.
next year. No, if they
I
go,
get it.
you
I get
create
it.
those spaces.
Yeah.
So what we're doing right now is looking at both, because we have to acknowledge that we had those consolidations created by the enrollment declines in those grade levels. And people I know want us to look at those, and certainly the school committee and others are going to want us to look at those because there's costs associated with it. So we have a little ways to go on that as well. And I know some people are going to want to talk about the principalship. So let me just say a word about that. So Joe and I continue to talk about his role, what we're doing here next year. I've had fairly lengthy conversations with both the vice principals. And right now, we're concentrating on the configuration. Because the configuration for next year and the years that drive us through 2019 have an impact on who the principal would be and what they're the principal of. Because you can imagine in a configuration where we have a K-4 school, whether it's on this site or somewhere else, and let's say Old Lincoln for a second is 5 through 8, through 2019, that drives our thinking in a very different way, right, than if it's some other grade configuration. So, again, I'm going to ask for your indulgence and some time on these things. But these things will begin to play themselves out pretty quickly, starting with the short-term space plan, which has to come in the next month. Does that all make sense? Okay. So you may want to ask about the I can tell you, very exciting what I'm going back to talk about tonight. Some of you may know that in the override study report, there is there's a set of recommendations beyond what these two groups recommended as potential overrides. There's a set of non-tax revenues that they recommended. In other words, both groups agreed that about $2.9 million could be garnered from some reductions on the town side budget and increased fees on the school and town side. And so what I'm going back to talk about tonight, my part of it, is to talk about those school-based fees. And those school-based fees that are in the report were increases in fees for early education, increased fees around our rental of property, including the increase to extended day that we're about to start in January, further increases beyond what we're putting in place. And so I'm going to lay out for them the challenges and opportunities with those fees. And then the town will do the same. You may know there have been recommendations about changes to parking rates, as an example, and refuse and trash, those kinds of things. And so that's the very exciting presentation tonight. And then next week, we'll be back before the Board of Selectmen talking about what this all looks like in a no override scenario. In other words, what would the reductions look like given our projections of our enrollment growth? And you may know that in a lot of what we've done now, we've changed the enrollment projections to assume 650 incoming kindergartners each year in 31 sections. This year, we today have 692 kindergartners today in the district. So, any of those or anything else? What do you want to talk about?
You mentioned your timeline for making space decisions town-wide on the various schools. What's the timeline for making decisions about space here at Devo and whether or not anybody will be going over to Old Lincoln?
This month?
Okay, it's probably the same.
I think that you talk about for next year?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we were in the middle of our FY16 budget, so it has a tremendous impact both on that no override scenario that I'm going to talk about next week, I mean, we have a plug number right now in there of about $680,000, I think it is, for staffing and other concerns of an ongoing concern at Old Lincoln. We need to decide whether we're gonna spend that, right? And as I said, I think there are challenges on both sides of this, and that have largely come about because of the slight declines we saw in the grades 4 through 8. So, but I think it has to be this month. Certainly, the longer range have to be decided this month. Now, some if I can hijack your question for a second. So some people have said, but you may not know. You may have an opportunity to look at a school building in another town, and it may not identify itself to you this month. It may be 3 months from now or a year from now. I will say there is a point, and we're involved with the architects quite a bit. There is a point where the plans are done, right, in a certain way to assume transitions, and there's not backing away from those. We're not there yet, so we could make one set of recommendations, and then a place could be identified in the next X number of months. But it's not long. It's certainly not. I don't think it can happen past the spring. Yeah.
You mentioned.
Question you didn't ask as well,
Yeah.
so I just want to answer that too.
Yeah.
You mentioned the difficulty in defining the role of the new principal, but what is the timeline for that hire?
So the first thing we need to do is figure out what the configurations are, both for next year and then through 2019. Or if we were able to move everyone out through 2018-ish. And so once we get that done, we'll lay out a process, and we'll be back with Dr. Allen to talk about what that process might look like and what the opportunities to be involved are. Yes, Mike.
So I don't understand why the configuration would have such a bearing on the principal selection, given the long-term vision, hopefully with the same principal, would be for us to return to a K-8 model.
Well, it is.
So then why does that affect the principal, unless you're thinking of a principal at a 3-year higher?
No, it's just that I have to identify. So we have to figure out not only what the principalship is, but what the vice principalships are associated with, let's say, Old Lincoln and here or somewhere else. And we have to figure out some other pieces in terms of the eligibility. I'm sorry, I should have said this before. In terms of the eligibility of certain people in interim roles. I mean, even so, you don't mind? Yeah. So even for Joe to continue on in certain roles, there are certain things we have to go through because he's retired with the state. So we're in the process of trying to figure out a number of those kinds of things as well. And we just need a little bit of time to do that. Yes, sir.
In one of the scenarios you referenced putting 77 kids here in 3 classrooms, which is 25, 26 kids per class.
Right.
Are there many classrooms in the system that are already at 25,
So
26?
that is what I said, and it's not what I meant to say, so I appreciate you asking, so I get to clarify. Right. So what we have to do is take a look at those grade levels, and we have a number of them that range right now from like 76 to 80, right? And some of you've been through this before, where we actually ask people, are you return, right? Those kinds of things. And what we're trying to get a handle on is, do we have an opportunity for consolidation? And I guess what I'm saying, so we wouldn't go into a situation where we knew we had 78, 80, 80. We wouldn't consolidate, right? We'd take a look and see whether they were within the parameters. And the answer to your question is yes, we do have a few, but only where we made certain assumptions based on the history of that building and those grade levels, and then that class proved us wrong, right? So we do have a couple of those 26s. We wouldn't go into a situation trying to create them. And what's difficult in this, there are some people who are pushing us, have pushed us to consider what happened last year in grade 4 through 8 as the new norm. Now, what we've done is we've actually had our data analysts go in and look, because we have a reason code, right, on why someone departs. And the reason codes don't lead us to a conclusion that this is associated. We've had people say, oh, it's people going private. Oh, it's it's not. And we have the data. It's not, right? So there's nothing in the data that says that this is going to repeat itself, right? But that doesn't mean it isn't.
So
Right. So we have to try to pay attention to that, and the other piece of it that's difficult is we have to pay attention to it earlier than we would like, right? Because sometimes we do consolidations in May or June, and if it's affecting what we're going to do with buildings, and we don't have till May or June, so we have to make those decisions earlier. I hope that sort of answered. You would ask something else though.
the quick follow-up then is, so
Yeah.
what is the largest class size you would target, and you would,
25
so,
in grades 25 and 4 through 8,
no.
not below 3rd grade. Yes, ma'am.
That I have a 4th grader and a 6th grader, so
Yes.
both of them have been in classes ranging from 17 to 21 or 22.
Yes.
It was the grade before. The 3rd grade is where the 5th section came.
Yes.
So they've been in pretty small classes all through.
Yes.
And I appreciate Greg's question. It's concerning to me if all of a sudden they're used to, my daughter has 18, I think, in her class, 6 or 7 girls. All of a sudden now they're 25 to 27. That's a lot. That's a lot more kids if it comes to that consolidation. That's a big number more than 18.
So let me go back to the beginning of what I said, okay? So let me go back to the beginning of what I said, because what I said was, because of what occurred last year, we could now have this opportunity to look at this differently. Now, I laid out reasons why one might want to, and I laid out reasons why someone might say that's not a great idea, right? Okay. I didn't say it was a good idea, right? I said I've been asked,
Right.
since the classes are now like this, couldn't you look at the opportunity to keep everyone here? And all I've said is, yes, and this is what it would take, right? This is what it would take. Now, we may conclude that that's not worth it, and particularly given that we have to make judgments in the
Yeah.
time frame that we have, right?
You don't know
So
what's
there's
gonna happen in
there's a lot
August,
of
right.
moving parts
Right.
to this that aren't very good, and that could lead people to Monday morning quarterback me next year. I love that. So right. So we have all that. So you're right. We don't go into it making judgments that we're going to create classes of this, and we'd have to be pretty certain, which would be pretty difficult to do within the time frames we have. Yes, ma'am.
Right.
Wouldn't, we're just talking about for the 1 year, right? This is
We're just talking about for 1
so
year.
just 1 year, so even if we were
We
to
are.
get at a bigger class size.
That's
3 or 4, it would
correct.
just
We're
be for
talking
1 year.
about, I mean, essentially the answer to the question of if that's what we looked to do,
Right.
right, given the amount of money we're gonna spend to open, and given that we've had these reductions that came
Right.
last year,
Right.
would we be willing to do this
For 1 year.
for 1 year
Right.
to accomplish that? And I've said, and I'll say more clearly, I guess, for me, it's as much about the quality of the environment that the adults have to work in, and I worry about that environment. I worry about a successful override that has ELL teachers and math specialists working in the hallway. I worry about that. I don't think that's a good message myself.
What would be your target class size for the old Lincoln if we transition it to old Lincoln?
So, I don't think we changed the number of sections. That doesn't completely answer your question. I don't think we changed the number of sections because we'd be talking primarily about 7th and 8th grade. And I think our classes in there run in the 20 to 22, right? Yeah. So I don't think it changes. We certainly, pardon?
80 students for 4 sections.
Yeah, so we don't consolidate any sections in there. And I mean, let's just take the 5 through 8 scenario for a second because I threw it out there, right? I don't think moving to Old Lincoln changes the configuration of those sections at all. We have room.
So
As much as
meaning that you have more control over the class size perhaps at Old Lincoln?
Meaning that we have more, if I don't answer it, just come back to me, okay? So meaning that we have more opportunity to manage the class sizes within our parameters than we would in this one-year scenario that I just laid out.
Where there's some randomness that could come in that
Yes.
might be a higher class or
Yes.
it might be
Yes.
fine within the recognized perimeter.
Yes.
There's a risk factor that you sort of suggested might
Oh, there's a risk
occur
factor.
by staying in this
Oh,
building.
there's clearly a risk factor. Again, and you, many of you have been at these that I've done for years, and we've talked about this here, right? We've talked about that this is a building. It's one of 2 or 3 in particular in the district where we have, I guess the term used during the override was churn, right? We have more, and churn makes for unpredictability, right? So, if I were looking at the Heath School and trying to make these judgments in January, quite frankly, it's a bit easier of a undertaking than it is here or at Lawrence or at Pierce.
And just one follow-up to this. I know the existing students are the existing students. Whether they move out is, their decision. But what about for the incoming class? Do you have any control over the enrollment of the kindergarten coming in, limiting that so that you could accomplish the goal of keeping people here?
So my control,
Yeah, like
Is-
border zones or something.
my control is largely buffer zones
Yeah.
and the ability to relocate a class out of the building, which I now have under school committee policy. I have the ability to take a class from a building, and if there isn't space, to move them over to Driscoll. Okay? The problem is, with that scenario, if you look at the document that we produced, they don't have any space either, for the most part. Okay? So, right? We've actually identified one strategy. I'll talk about it in our school. It'll be more fun. So we've identified one strategy in the Baker scenario that says one way you could get to modulars in 2016, 2017 is to move one of their kindergarten classes. In other words, create 5 kindergarten classes at Baker the way we always do, but take one of them and move them to a space that we have for 1 year, because then it's taken up by students at that school, at the Heath School. Okay? We have a 1-year opportunity. That's part of the equation in that building. That might get us there. That might be the strategy we employ. Much more difficult to do here, because if you take a look at the 2 schools who you share the most buffer with, Lawrence and Pierce, you just happen to be in the corridor of the biggest part of our problem.
I have a question, but first I want to clarify. So
Sure.
I want to make sure that I understand. Because
Okay.
I had the feeling from all the other meetings that we've had that 7th and 8th are moving for sure in September.
Right.
To Old Middle.
And that's how we've been.
And now there's a possibility that they're not? Or
Well, all I'm saying, because it's been put on the table, right? Because I've heard it, principals heard it, right? Is that the numbers that we saw last year coming into this year, that decline in enrollment in those grade levels in 4 through 8, people have said, does that change anything? And all I'm saying is, it could under certain circumstances, right? And given, that we have an override question in front of the Board of Selectmen, given that we're talking about moving students for that year before the construction project begins, given the costs associated with that, it's my responsibility to actually explore that, right? And deal with that within all, and I've laid out for you the pieces.
But
Right.
as of right now,
They're moving.
As of right now,
They're moving.
No,
They're
that's,
moving.
That's what I'm.
And again, we just have to go through an exercise of looking at those numbers and making sure we can completely stand behind that. So when people say, well, because they will, in September, you didn't have to do that because this happened and this happened and this happened, we can say yes, but when we had to make the decision, these were the data that were in front of us. Make sense? Okay. You had a question though.
Yes, I had a question. You were talking before about exploring possibilities to move everyone out of the building when we start the construction.
Yes.
Have, we had a conversation last week or something like that, about the possibility of Pioneer College. Have you explored that?
We have.
You have, okay.
We have. Short term, we have. I should leave it at we have. Yes. We don't believe at the present we have opportunities there. I should leave it at that. Yes.
So I think you said this year we have something like 690 kindergartners, is that correct?
692.
And last year? Is it roughly the same?
66,
Thank you, Joe, for
wasn't
giving
it?
this to me. So I actually look like I know what I'm doing. And if I put my glasses on, I can actually read it. How about that? 645, and the year before that, you're going to ask, which is 689, and that would lead one to a conclusion that our 650 might even be low. Yes, we adjusted. That's a good question. So we adjusted from 630
Yeah,
to the 650.
yeah.
It could very well be that by next fall, we'll be looking at some adjustment that we think we can justify, that's above that.
Would it not, given it's more difficult to create space than to not use space, wouldn't it be more prudent to come up to use a higher estimate?
Well, that depends on one's point of view. I mean, there are people that think we've overestimated the space that we need now.
They think 650 is an overestimation
They
based on the
think,
higher.
they think our numbers lead to an overestimation of the space that we need now, yes. There are people, if you come to some of these really fun meetings that I get to.
But so that,
Yeah.
so where did 650 come
It came, I wish I'd Peter, it came essentially from an averaging of those last 3-ish years in that range.
from? That's not.
Well, it was, no, it wasn't, it was the last 4, I'm sorry, you can and I can too, it was the last 4, I believe. We adjusted up, we've been working with 630 all through the override process, but when the 690 came along, right? And so people have said to me, so what if next year it's 700, right? Well, then we're gonna have to deal with those numbers.
When B-Space started, we were working with 600.
Right. And that is the problem that we've had all through this, and some people have stood up and rightfully said so at a number of public meetings, is these numbers have accelerated away from us all through this process. I mean, you've been sitting here listening to me for a number of years and know what we were talking about earlier. The first group that we talked about in terms of our enrollment growth, I think they were in the upper 480s, and we were talking about enrollment growth. Right, by first grade they were 500, right? And we said, wow, that's different, because until then it'd been 420 to 440. And every 3-year cohort from the beginning of this growth to this date has been larger than the 3-year cohort that came before them. Every time.
So does 650 a good estimate, given that knowledge? I worry about us anchoring based on the B-Space figure or the 480 figure and underestimating as a result to perhaps please people who would be cranky if you said 680. But if you look objectively at the best data that you have right now, without that anchoring, that seems like that's the right number, whatever that number is. Maybe it's 650, but it doesn't sound like it's 650 based on what you're saying.
Yeah, if we have another year above that number, I mean, I would want to adjust it up. Yes, sir. Sorry, I keep over. I have a tendency not to go this way. Sorry.
Does the fact that you're looking now to move all the kids out, potentially out of the school,
Yes.
while the construction going on,
Yes.
is that going to shorten the project at
Yes.
all? Okay, I apologize.
That's okay. No, it's fine. No, up to a year.
Up to a year, so it would be a 2-year project as opposed to a 3-year project?
It would get us back in here, we think, in September of 18 instead of September of 19. And if you're going to ask what it would save us, I don't know, because those cost estimates have not been done, although we know it would save us money.
Do you
Because
think
it's-
it's in rent somewhere else, it would still say net out?
Yes, we believe it would.
As 2 years of K to 5 or K to 5 be renting somewhere else, that cost is less than 1 year
It might be K
of
to
additional
4.
Consideration of having the.
We believe, roughly speaking, we believe that we would net out a savings, yeah.
You also have to understand, if you're renovating a building with children in it,
Yeah.
there are costs
Right.
associated with that. But on the other side, there's transportation, there's
Right.
rent for the building,
Right.
there's transportation to the
Yeah.
building.
Right.
And so anyway, there are costs on both sides, we don't have that number.
Right.
But it seems roughly arbitrary to say it would save us money.
No,
Because if we haven't done the math and there's big figures on both sides, I don't know why no one's done the math, but it seems like, how do we know what the sign of the delta is if no one's done the math?
You wanna say something else?
yeah.
We have a 5th school committee member in here now, so we have to advertise the meeting, I think.
It's just, we know from other experiences with schools where we've moved the kids out, we've looked at phasing, and the costs, the contractors' costs are so much greater because they have to do things differently with kids in the building. They don't have the full site to work. They can't put all their men in at the same time. So they charge a premium right away for the phasing. And then the extra year, so the contractor has to pay his workers all during that time. Whereas the cost of moving, when we moved into Old Lincoln, the cost was nominal, so to speak. I mean, we didn't pay rental, we paid for the upkeep of the building. So there's, and even the busing of all the kids and the extra staff, all that still at Montville came out to a delta of us being on the plus side. And the plus side of having it in 2 years as opposed to 3 years is.
But you're right, as we are able to get a little bit more serious with the sites that we're at least looking at, I mean, if they start to look a little bit more serious, we'll have to do that. But it's a year.
Even the design team feels it would be a savings.
Right.
And they've done many projects.
Yes, sir.
If this is too granular, punt it. But how does busing actually work? Like, what are some of the nuts and bolts? Is it like an hour before school, a half an hour before school? Our kids are moving, that's clear. So what are we going to be dealing with here?
So it's a good question, thanks, and I'll do it up here somewhere and leave it to Mary Murphy to come over and work with people when the time's right. So what we've done here in each of our projects, and there are a number of people at Runkle who can answer this question as well, parents. So what Mary did in that project was she formed a parent advisory group who helped her design routes.
It's neighborhood busing.
Right.
The Baker parents asked the same thing. My kids went to Lawrence during the renovation, and my first image of that was that we would be taking the kids to a construction site to get on a bus and go somewhere.
No,
It's not the way it works.
No, it's from your,
Neighborhood busing,
right.
there are bus
Stops
stops
and-
all over the neighborhood. They pick up the kids, and it's all organized well ahead of time with parents and with the
Right, and
things.
so what
it's-
Mary's really good at is helping design those stops and telling you what buses can and can't do, and creating the right kinds of environment, and working with parents to design those. So that process, I mean, what we know is on whatever grade levels are gonna be at Old Lincoln, that process will start soon. And if we're going to move, we have an opportunity to move students somewhere else, we'll have to look at that as well. And the times will be as determined by where we are, right? And understand that, I mean, so even though we have no site, right, we have a few ideas, we have a few places we're talking to, we've actually looked at what starting times might need to look like to accommodate traffic and those kind, I mean, there are people that have experience with running schools for a year or so not in their town. When I was in Beverly, we had a school building near the Beverly-Salem Bridge that we weren't using. We had built new schools and we had redistricted. And Salem rented that building for 2 years and held school there from one of their elementary schools that was being renovated. They rented that space from us for 2 years. So it's done. I think you've had experience with it, right? In North Reading and Stoneham, right? Which is a hike, yes. Yes, sir.
This is another kind of maybe very detailed question, and excuse me if I'm just missing something here, but just logistically, if you start introducing neighborhood busing, how do you handle it with young kids? At this point, a parent has to meet the bus. There's, hopefully everybody tries to make the classroom on time to pick up their kids, but in the school, if something happens, your car breaks down or whatever, a teacher's not gonna just put your kid out into the street,
No, they won't do that.
Right. So, but a bus that has to come to a neighborhood stop doesn't have the opportunity to say, gee, your parents aren't here, something happened, we'll sit here and wait with you. You know, what happens?
No, but there are, so you're right, it's a little granular for me, I can get you the specific answer, but there are rules of the road around buses and dropping off kids of certain ages.
Right.
Right, so those rules are created and they're respected and people carry them out. So no, they wouldn't,
Right.
they
No,
wouldn't
well,
drop
so
that
saying,
child,
obviously
no, they
wouldn't,
wouldn't drop that
right.
child off. And I don't know exactly what would happen, but there's
They
a
have-
protocol
there's a
put in.
system.
Yes,
But at this point, it would be kind of, the general expectation of it would be that with a very young child, the parent would be showing up at the bus stop.
right,
to
and,
pick up.
and we also have a little experience at Old Lincoln. There's no Rockville people here, except I'm going to be on tape and I'm going out live right now, right? So, you know, we knew there was there were a certain percentage of people who, even though they helped us design bus routes and whatever, they were still going to drop, right? And they did, and we expected that, and the police expected that in terms of the traffic around there and all those kinds of. We know that will happen, right? And so we plan accordingly for it. Yes.
So a couple thoughts. One is, you know, there's a lot of we don't know yet tonight for various topics. So I'm wondering if it might be possible for you to come back in early January when you do have some of these topics book a little closed on some of these, like
Yeah,
the
maybe
search
do, I don't know,
and
maybe
the,
do
you
PTO
know,
mornings or something like
because
that.
there's no detail with anything yet, and I appreciate that. I understand why, but you know, if there are more in-depth questions we have on how these things are going to play out,
Right.
I
Yeah.
think it would be helpful if you could come back.
Yeah, and it may be, I mean, yes, and, you know, so as we start to plan for next year, and we'll start to do that in January, so it will be Mary Murphy who will be here, and Mary Murphy's our transportation director, who will be here and looking for help with designing.
I'm not just referring to buses.
No, I know you're not.
Okay.
And a lot of it will happen with Monica, right? And so those pieces, and it has been, right?
Yeah.
And so those pieces will be in place. And in terms of as we refine these kinds of things, what the capital improvement plan looks like, what the impact of that is for this school,
Right.
I'm always happy to come back and we'll do something in the morning or we'll figure it
Yeah,
out.
that'd be great.
Okay.
I had one
Yeah,
other
go ahead.
question about the search for the principal.
Yep.
My understanding was that we need to do a complete and thorough search, even if we would love to have Joe stay with us for another year. My understanding is we still have to go through that process and prove that it was a failed search in order to have.
So that's one alternative.
Okay, so there's other alternatives?
That's
I guess-
one alternative. We can explore with the department, who have very specific rules around retirees and working. Right, there are conversations that we can have that we've had before and that other districts have had to make that work.
Okay, I guess my question or my concern is that if we do have to go through that search, or we make the decision that we want to go ahead and do a search to find someone permanent here, are we shortchanging ourselves by, are we losing time and
No, I think
have to do a
Jan-
compressed search?
I think January's
Have-
fine, and
okay.
so you didn't ask it this way,
That's what
but
I-
I think if I was giving you this answer the first or second week of January, I'd be worried, right? But I'm not, right? So by that point, we sort of have to have some of this figured out, and these other pieces will be in place by then, and we'll be able to figure those things out. And not the least of them is involves the Department of Education and their licensure rules and their waiver rules and those kinds of things.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a follow-up question
Sure.
about the principal. So, if come January, the decision is to start looking for a new principal.
Yes.
You said before that it depends if we're going to move the children out, and if it's from K to 4th or K to 3 or K to 5 or all those things. And it's a follow-up question also to what the gentleman here said. Are we going to look for a long-term principal if we decide to go that route?
Yeah.
A long-term principal for the next many years, as you know, the school has not had a long-term principal for so long. So,
Well, it depends on what you mean by long term. As
Long
I've
term,
said
many
over
years,
here, as I've said over here in forums before, right? And said at other buildings in forums before, 5 years and beyond is long-term. In the world that principals live in today, that's long-term. So that's why I would sort of not challenge the assumption, but I'd say it depends on what you mean by long-term.
That's what I mean when I say long-term as well.
Right.
I mean, I'm just
Okay.
saying, not for 1 or 2 years,
Right,
right?
right.
So if we are looking for a long-term principal, then we are looking for a principal who will take on a school that is a K-8 school, because
Right.
the kids are,
Right.
the 7th and 8th are coming back, or 6,
Right.
7, and 8, or 5, 6, 7, or whatever
Right.
it is. So, so I didn't,
So let me just be really clear about what I was trying to say. We just need to be able to be very transparent with someone about all of that. So I will tell you, as I told your PTO officers not more than a couple weeks ago, we are pursuing all of these avenues right now. I said to you earlier, we're talking to people who currently work in the building. Okay? Yes. Are we talking to people outside of the district about potential principalships? Yes. Right? So we're setting ourselves for whatever we need to do, whether it's here or at another building in the district. Not that I know that I have any principalships open, but we always keep those channels open, and particularly when we are in a situation like this and we know we might be looking, and we might be looking in a particular place. I mentioned here last year that I said at Lincoln, I went to Lincoln last year at this time and specifically told people we are looking for someone with urban experience, because when we look back through the history of this school, those are the people that have done well here. Those are the people that have stayed. Those are the people that have had a great experience here, right? And so that's where we're looking, and that's what we did. Those are some people we targeted to talk to. That's who we talked to. That's who applied. That's who we hired, right? And so we have some pieces to figure out about this, but yes, it's a long term, right? Yes, it's a K-8, and yes, there are lots of years of some intermediate steps in between now and then, right? And as I say to Monica all the time about the experience that she's agreed to undertake for us, right? A lot can happen between now and 2019. A lot.
Between September and October.
Okay. I said between now and 2019. You say between September and October. Right. Please keep me and don't let me go to the board. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
2 questions. Is there any or what percentage risk could you put on construction not starting by September?
I was 5 minutes away from getting out of here. The only so the discussion and the approval from MSBA went very well. The work that the architects have done, particularly over the last number of weeks, in looking at some of the concerns that people had, have gone very well. Our discussions with the town about the financing plan, some of which is dependent, right, on the override, have gone, or the debt exclusion, excuse me, are going really well. I mean, I think there's we're planning to begin this project in July of 16. Until somebody tells me otherwise, right, we're planning to begin this project in July of 16, and to do whatever steps are necessary, right, to make sure, because we have a lot to do. We were just talking about, where's Dave? We were just talking about this downstairs, right? We have a lot with whoever's here, and then let's assume it's K through 6, right, up through then. We have a lot to do in 2 weeks, or whatever number of weeks until we turn the building over to them, right? We're going to need to move a grade out or 2 grades out, number 1. We're going to need to occupy a particular part of this building and create the other part for the contractors, and turn it over to them by around July 1st. That's a lot, right? So sort of everything we've seen with all the pieces that need to fall into place, they are falling into place. And so that's the best information I can give you. Do things happen? Yeah, I've been associated with 8 or 9 building projects, and things happen that delay them. And, you know, I keep talking about getting back in here in September of 18 or September of 19. Is there some chance that that wouldn't happen? Sure. You know, at Runkle School we found, some of you may know this, at Runkle School we found the old school. For years, people, right, didn't know where the old school was. They didn't know if it was down on the back corner on the field or if it was up closer to the building. We found it. It was up near the building. We found it because they dug it up, and we found that they'd essentially taken, I'm allowed to say this, right? That they'd essentially taken the desks, the clocks, and everything and thrown them in the hole when they, right? And we found that, and that was a slight delay. That was a slight delay. And so, can I predict? No.
So, shifting gears entirely, can you talk to us a little bit about the most recent report card and how we should feel about how devotion is doing? You know, are we trending in the right direction? Because at the end of this, what we're most concerned about is our kids' education. And are we in a good place now? How do we sustain that? Who is most likely to suffer? Is it the really gifted children? Is it children with special needs? Is it the average bear in the middle? And what are the warning signs, and what are the things that are most likely to be at risk? And I know this is a very open-ended question, but deliberately, you know, my concern at the end of the day is the education, the quality, and my concern is that we kind of take a sign like, oh, it's only a year, I might not quite unpack all my books, or I might, and I don't want to implicate any teacher in that, but we all get into that zone. Oh, there's only 2 weeks to Christmas, I'm going to slack off. There's a temptation when you know transitions are going to happen to not quite dig in.
I will say that, let me just say this. So to that, and then I'll go back to the rest of your question, and thank you, I really appreciate the question. So that's never been my experience, that's not been my experience here. And quite frankly, I've gone through, you know, the experience of having a school that Joe moved to the Runkle School over to the old Lincoln. That was not our experience at the old Lincoln School. That was not our experience at all. That was a great experience, great educational experience for kids.
Mm-hmm.
Bill, I'll jump in for a second.
Yeah.
Let me assure you that the devotion school is moving ahead. We're improving. We're focused on how to improve the education. You're dealing with a transition, stressful, a lot of change is about to happen, but your staff is absolutely focused and everyone's working, doing the best they can to improve the education for kids.
I have been experienced never working with this guy, where when building projects were coming up and whatever, people looked at things like school improvement plan and said, well, all of our goals should be associated around this because we're going to be moving and whatever, and that's not been the experience. So
I just want to clarify that it's not for lack of skill or investment, it's more the constraint.
Right.
At one point, do the constraints put on these people become so significant that they can't?
So this is the part where I get to say this is not necessarily about the override, but in terms of what we've put forward, it's exactly to your question, right? So we chose a particular strategy X number of years ago to make sure that we were able to maintain the academic excellence of this place and to meet the needs of our students. And it was that we were going to focus on the classroom. You'll see that in every budget message since '07. You'll see it in every budget message since the growth began. We were going to take the resources we had and we were going to devote it to the classroom. And there was a cost to that, right? And the cost to that was we didn't keep up with the literacy staffing, the math staffing, specialist staffing, the guidance counselors, the nurses, and some of those other, what I'll call tier 1 supports for kids, you know, occupational therapists, speech therapists, and whatever, that are not associated with special education, but are more in a preventative mode. We didn't. We couldn't. We made a choice, right? And what we've said is the growth has outmaneuvered our ability to provide those services anymore, and it's enough. It needs to stop right now, right? And so while people are working very hard, and you know, quite frankly, I think overall our achievement levels are good. I worry about the gaps. So when I look at our data around kids who are coming to us from poverty, right? Those numbers those numbers are not good. When I look at our gaps for students of color, those numbers are not where we would want them to be, and they're not where they were 5 years ago. Right? We were closing gaps, and gaps have widened. And I believe it's directly attributable to our growth and the kinds of supports for teachers and kids that we've not been able to provide over this number of years. And what I've said, anywhere I can recently, is it needs to stop now. Right? And so, as I put forward what the override might look like under these two scenarios, I was criticized because in the 65% number, we cut some programs in order to provide the literacy staffing and the technology plan and whatever. And I said, that it isn't a recommendation, but that scenario that I put forward is just a matter of your priorities. So my priorities in that number are pretty clear. They are in closing those gaps and making sure the kids who are coming to us from poverty have those experiences, right? That they're not getting right now that are driving those numbers. And other people feel differently. They think we should choose to spend our dollars in a different way, right? And so that's my answer to your question is the scores are okay. I'm not sure they are where they should be for this district. But the gaps, particularly for students who are living in poverty or students of color, are widening, and they're not acceptable. I can do one more, and then I need to go.
This actually isn't a question. This is a follow-up, and it's just kind of a recommendation to everybody in this room. Everybody in this room is concerned about the direction education is going, exactly the things Dr. Lupini is talking about. And as a town meeting member, there were a number of emails on our listserv today really questioning whether this override, the higher number in particular, is going to pass, because we represent 20% of the voting population of Brookline, those of us with children in the public schools. And what I say, and what I intend to write later tonight, I have the energy, is that 80% that doesn't have children in public schools either had children in the public schools at one time or moved here to send them to public school once they have them. Not everybody, but a large percentage of that. Talk to your neighbors. Mm-hmm. If you have neighbors who are senior citizens, talk to them. Tell them your children got a chance to have a great education in classrooms that weren't huge with good supports. Our children deserve the same. So this isn't a question, but this is a plea. Mm-hmm. Talk to your neighbors. It's important.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Let me just say one other thing before I go. The people who you have the opportunity to work with in this building are among some of the greatest people I know in education, right? Joe, Monica, Jen, Dave are really terrific people who I just enjoy working with. I love to come over here if it's just to spend time with them and hear what's going on in this building with your teaching staff and with this great administrative staff in supporting your children. So thank you, and thanks for coming out tonight to spend some time with me.